So, welcome audience here at the Estonian Museum of Architecture, and as well as in everybody in Zoom. I have an honor to present to you our today's guest, a speaker who is a graphic novelist, Benoit Peeters. My name is Sandra Mälk. I work at the Estonian Museum of Architecture as a curator and archivist. And today's lecture is named The Obscure Cities, Imaginary Architectures Between Utopia and Dystopia. After the lecture, we're going to have a small talk, Q&A. So everybody who has a question, please write it down in the Zoom chat. I will gladly present this to Benoit and then we can discuss it. For the Estonian audience, this lecture is going to be in English, as well as the talk after the lecture. Et Eesti publikule ütlen ka, et kogu loeng siis toimub inglise keeles. Ja pärast saab ka loengut vaadata YouTube'i kanalil, mis on siis Eesti Arhitektuurimuuseumi YouTube'i kanal. Ja loodetavasti lisanduvad sinna ka subtiitrid. Today's event is supported by the French Institute in Estonia. So thanks a lot for this opportunity to make it possible. And this we have a reason why this lecture is taking place. We have here at the Estonian Museum of Architecture an exhibition called The Obscure World of the Urbotect, Architecture Comics by Benoit Peeters and Françoise Cotin. So this is the reason, and it's linked to this exhibition. I will greatly suggest to visit this exhibition if you have an opportunity. It has many original drawings from the King Baudouin Foundation collection, which is in Brussels. So they gladly lend us some of the nice works from this Obscure Cities series. So, yes, who is Benoit Peeters? I think most of you already know, but I will make a short introduction. Benoit Peeters is a graphic novelist, writer, critic, and he has studied philosophy at the University of Sorbonne. He has written a master thesis under the supervision of Roland Barthes, and he has written more than 60 different articles and books. One of the latest being a biography about a psychoanalyst, Sandor Ferenczi. And also he has a very popular book, which has been translated to 10 languages. It's a biography of Jacques Derrida. And also he's an expert on Hergé, a Belgian cartoonist who has written and made Adventures of Tintin. So in the 1980s, Benoit Peeters with Françoise Cotin started making Obscure Cities albums. And it's been, there's already 11 albums in the series. And these albums show different cities which have different architectural scenery. So here is our lovely guest in Paris currently, Benoit Peeters. The floor is yours. So thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. So thank you for organizing this event. I would have liked to come to Tallinn and discover the exhibition, even if I know the drawings. And I have seen some pictures of your beautiful museum. But we will do it in the modern contemporary way. We have to do it that way, and I will show you some pictures, and then we can have some questions and probably answers. So I will try to share my screen. Do you see the images?
Yes, we can see it. Yeah,
Yes.
everything is okay.
Thank you very much. So this will be a brief story about the work that we have done with my very good friend and great artist, François Skeuten. He created many things, not only graphic novels or comics, but also a lot of illustration and scenographies and different projects. And we are friends since our childhood, because we were 12 when we met at school. This picture is from the beginning of our collaboration when we were 21 or something like that, in the beginning of the 80s. And when we were children, we already created a small newspaper together. He was drawing all the time, I was writing. And when we met again many years later, we have continued in that direction. He published his first comic story at the age of 16. A few years later, I published my first novel, and then we met and decided to try to do something together. At that time in France and Belgium, there was a very important magazine. There were many magazines for comics, Metal Hurlant, Heavy Metal, where he first published his some short stories. But then there was À Suivre. À Suivre published authors like Hugo Pratt, the father of Corto Maltese, or Jacques Tardy, or Comès, or many others. And at the beginning, the magazine was all in black and white, but the color appeared after 2 years. And when we had our first ID, it became Les Murailles de Samaris, the Great Walls of Samaris. It was in color, and it was really intended for that magazine. This is the first page of Les Murailles de Samaris, and you can directly see something strange because we don't see any character, any hero. We see a city. We are discovering a city, traveling through the city, and we hear a voice or we read the voice of a character, but we will need 3 pages to discover the character. And at that time, architecture was not as present in architecture. Of course, we can remember some old comics like Little Nemo by Winsor McCay, where architecture was very, very present. But generally, architecture and cities were a background. And in our story, 2 cities were major elements. So we discover this city with a very specific architecture, a sort of Art Nouveau architecture, and we see that there is a real general intention and pattern layout for the inside and for the outside. Here is a portrait by François Skeuten of the great Art Nouveau architect Victor Horta, the major Belgian architect, and all of his surviving buildings are in Brussels. So when we were young and later also, we discovered a lot of his architecture and his dreams for a sort of Art Nouveau Brussels, which was impossible. It only existed in some drawings. But in our story, in the beginning of Les Murailles de Samaris, we have some sort of Art Nouveau designed city. Here is one important building by Victor Horta. This is a small house in Brussels, in the center of the city, designed by another architect. But this spirit, this Art Nouveau spirit around 1900 was present in many cities in Europe, as you know, and probably also you have some Art Nouveau buildings in Tallinn. And so we has some inspirations. And as you can see, even when we discover the character, he is rather small, and we are more impressed probably by the city. He will leave this city, go to another city far away, and discover very strange things and be transformed forever. This was the first book, and when the book was published, a little more than 1 year after the pre-publication in the magazine À Suivre, we had already began a new story, not with the same character, uh, not in the same town, but in the same spirit. And so the publishers said, oh, you should have a general title for the series, and we chose together Les Cités Obscures, the obscure cities. Why are they obscure? Not because they are not sunny, but because they are very mysterious, and we always have to discover the strange aspects of those fantastic cities. And so the second story, La Fièvre d'Urbicande, which is represented by many pages in the exhibition in the Architecture Museum of Tallinn. The second story was published in black and white because it was a long story, and at that time for long stories by Casterman, black and white was needed. And this is a story of an urbanitect. So he's not just an architect, he's also an urbanist. And I created this word of urbatect, so both talents. And it was used by some people in real life. The beginning of the story is a letter from the urbatect to the authority of the city of Urbicande. He wants to build a third bridge, a great bridge, because the city is separated in two parts, and two parts are very difficult to connect. At that time, we thought a lot about Berlin, and Berlin, as you remember, was separated in two towns, and there were some strange and difficult communications between East and West Berlin. This is Mr. Robic, the urbatect, and this is the town that he designed. He created this gigantic cities with only a few inhabitants. You can imagine that the weather is very cold, very windy, and everything is massive. So we have a different representation of this town. And we had at that time many inspirations from different artists and architects, especially the Italian futurist artist as Santelia. Santelia was a very young architect. He was killed during First World War, and so he only created some visions of future architecture, but he didn't build them. Fortunately, probably, because it's paper architecture, imaginary architecture, but maybe in his mind it was not as imaginary. So we thought, what would happen if such a town was really built? Another inspiration was Le Corbusier, and Le Corbusier was a very major influence for François Skeuten father, Robert Skeuten. He was an architect, and when we were kids, he always spoke with a lot of respect about the great planification of Le Corbusier, and what a pity it was that he was not able to build everything during the 20s and the 30s. But when we discovered with François some drawings about the future of Paris, Le Plan Voisin pour Paris, we were scared because we thought, oh, this is not Paris anymore. And the same type of plans were designed for many cities, and sometimes it became reality. So it was a part of inspiration as the father of Francois Robert-Schuiten himself. Some aspects of his ideas and his personality are part of the story or the inspiration, of course. It's the extraordinary movie Metropolis by Fritz Lang. And we were also interested in Albert Speer. We see him on the left. He was the architect for Hitler and rebuilt Berlin in a totalitarian way. So I remember that I had read at that time the memoirs of Speer and many books about him. And so this is the type of architecture that Mr. Robic built for Urbicand, but something happens from the beginning of the story, from the first page of the real comic part of the story. A strange cubic structure was discovered, and we don't know where it comes from. It's very hard, and it will begin to grow. This is the center of the story. This is a major element. Everything will be transformed. The life of the architect and also the whole town of Urbicand. Order and disorder are working together. He's a scientific person, so he wants to calculate how it will work, how far it will grow. But as you can see, the expansion of this structure, it's very, very quick and with a lot of surprise and danger. So with this simple idea, the conflict between the growing cubic structure and the architectural structure of Urbicand, we build the whole story. And so for many architects or town planners, this story was, let's say, important, or they found in it a lot of themes to discuss or to think about. Here we see how the city is transformed, people using the structure to build new things, to bring some vegetables in the town, and so 100-page story created in black and white, but in the exhibition you can discover some pages of the new edition because we have decided recently to publish the Fièvre d'Urbicand in color with the help of our friend Jacques Durieux. And this is the first page of the new color version. And I just received yesterday the first copy of the color book, and it will be published in France in a few days. Each story in the Obscure Cities is very different from another one, even for the period, because you could say maybe, even if it's in an imaginary world, Les Morailles de Saint-Maurice has a 1900 reference, and maybe the Fièvre d'Urbicand, the 1925 references. But here with La Tour, the tower, we are near to the Middle Age or the beginning of Renaissance in a giant tower, inspired, of course, by the famous painting by Bruegel, but also by many, many other paintings. So architecture is also very present, but it's not really a city. It's something a little different. And we dreamed about such a painting, and we thought if we could enter through one of these doors and discover one character working there, it could be the beginning of a story. So we wanted to transform one image in a whole story. Some inspirations were given by the machines by Leonardo da Vinci, by the engravings of Piranesi, Italian engraver in the 18th century with his imaginary prisons. We were also impressed by Orson Welles, by his movies, but also by his Falstaff character in the Falstaff movie. So we mixed many references, many other than just those three ones, and then we try to enter in the spirit of a character. And the character that we see here is Giovanni, with him a young woman that he will meet during his travel, Milena. And at the beginning, Giovanni is alone in a small part of the tower, and he has to restore it, to maintain it. But of course, this small part of the tower is far too big, far too large for him, and he has too much work to do, and he is waiting for an inspector, but the inspector is never coming, so he becomes to be desperate. And as you can see, the condition of the tower is not so good. The tower is still unfinished, but the ruins are already coming. And of course, if we imagine the tower as a movie, it would be very expensive, especially in the 80s, before all the digital effects. And some years after the publication of this story, we met a great movie director, Terry Gilliam, and he said, "Oh, I love your story. I would like to make a movie with it, but it's too expensive." And we said, "Oh, if it's too expensive, even for Mr. Gilliam, director of Brazil and Munchausen and so many great movies, then it will stay as a comic strip, as a graphic novel, and we intended it to do it in a total freedom, with no necessity to have the largest audience or to find too much money. And of course, there is the patience and the talent of Francois Caton, and each page of our books represents 1 week of work, one real week. There is a sort of secret in this story by Latour, because the story is in black and white, but the characters living in the tower have no representation of the form of the tower, because it's so big, so huge. And so some paintings are existing, and people want to see those paintings, to see how is the tower looking. And when we discover those paintings, they are in color in a black and white world. So people cannot really speak about them. For them, it's just something like a fourth dimension or magic dimension, and it will have a great importance for the end of the story. Of course, I will not tell you the end of the story. I hope that someday you will be able to read it. So book after book, we began to imagine this world, and to design some maps, to find some new names from some towns, like Altaplana, the city of the archives. And now Altaplana is also the name of a website where you can find a lot of elements about the obscure cities, thanks to Eelco Brunsema with us, altaplana.be. But it was just a name on the map, like Blossfeldstadt or the Nemo Lake or Araxes or Brussels. And Brussels is a very large city, bigger than Paris. And the form of Brussels is the form of the whole Belgium, but it's not Brussels, even if the name Brussels has different spelling. Brussels is a mirror of Brussels, but a crazy mirror. It's a city who wants to be bigger than every other city, to be transformed very quickly. And so we had a huge documentation about the story of Brussels. This is a view in the middle of 19th century, with a river crossing the town, and old constructions. And suddenly people decided to transform deeply the story, to forget this dirty river called La Seine, but it's not the same river than in Paris. And so a big part of the center was destroyed for those transformations. Very strange idea to have the river disappearing. And then Brussels decided to build the biggest justice palace in the world. And an architect called Joseph Poulart created the plans for this incredible palace. And this building has a lot of importance in our story and in different stories of the obscure city. It's not called the Justice Palace, but the Palace of the Three Powers. And so every important element of the town is in this building. Brussels decided also at the end of 19th century to have the train crossing the city from south to north, and there were a lot of new destructions during 50 years. So we used some elements of this rich documentation and of course some elements of our personal knowledge of the city, because Françoise Cuyten was born in Brussels and lived there. I was born in Paris, but I was during my childhood in Brussels, and I know a lot about the city, even if now I'm living in Paris. So we didn't want to make a didactic or historical story about the transformation of Paris, but to of Brussels, but to have the story of a character, a man who owns a shop with plants and flowers, but believing suddenly in the power of plastic. And so he wants to have a modern shop with flowers in plastic. This is modernity. And in fact, when you look at some old books or magazines or catalogs in the 1940s or 50s, you can see the importance of plastic. And people really believed that plastic was something new, extraordinary, and would transform everything. Now we have another perception, of course, but it was funny to go back to this period of great hope. And so our character, Constant Abels, a typical Belgian name, is living in the center of Brussels in a very old style house, but he's dreaming about modernity, transformation, and so. And there are great plans in Brussels and very big model of the future town. And you can imagine how much money they spent to create just this model. And of course, you can imagine that the political authorities are not very clear with money questions, but this is just the background of the story. And our character, Constant, becomes ill, and he will be first in a very old hospital and then in a new clinic, even if the new clinic is not finished. So the situation for him will be very difficult. As you can see, very often in the obscure city, the way of transportation are a little different from the real situation in our world. So some elements are very close to our reality, and some elements like the Zeppelin are very prominent in the obscure cities and almost forgotten in our world. Here you can see what happens with the model of the future town. They have a lot of problems with water, money problems, of course, and the idea to transform everything in the same moment seems to be a little difficult. And so at the end, our characters have to leave Brussels. Architecture is a very important element, but it's not the only one. And book after book, we tried to improve ourselves, to create real and interesting characters, and not to tell the story of architecture in comics. But architecture is still there, and also the question of the body, the space, the structure, like in the story L'Enfant Penché, the leaning girl, story of an adolescent called Mary, and she is in Alaxis um, and with a family, and she is going in an, I don't know the exact word for this attraction, but just after some strange events, she cannot stand normally. She is leaning, and when her father tried to put her in the right position, she falls, and so the family becomes a new attraction in this town, and they are not very satisfied with this. But when Mary can stay just normally, what is normal now for her, everything works. But the family doesn't accept. They are very serious people, so they put the poor girl in a very strict school, but the other girls are not very pleasant with her. And then Mary is leaving. It's a very long story. It's like in a novel. She works in a circus because she is so extraordinary. She can do some very strange things, but she's not happy there. And then she will meet a scientist who is interested in her case and persuaded that she comes from another planet, and they will travel together to this unknown planet. But in this book, we use also some photographic pages showing a character in our world, in a desert part of France, L'Aubrac, and his name is Augustin des Ombres. He's a painter, and he's dreaming about a girl and trying to paint her, and then he will enter in his own paintings. He will become a part of the graphic world and meet Mary in a sort of no man's land. They have a brief love story, but at a certain moment he wants to go back to his world, and then she takes his hand, and as you can see, I hope that you can see it, there are graphic lines on his hand, and forever the memory of this travel through the worlds and through the images. So it was something interesting for us. We worked with a friend, a very close friend, photographer, Marie-Françoise Plissard. I created some books with her, so photographic novels, and here we crossed the art of comics and the art of photographic narrations. This was a very specific experience. It was almost impossible to describe it to our publisher, but when he saw the page, he was surprised and appreciated the idea. Sometimes we take our inspiration, or should I say the characters of the Obscure Cities takes their inspiration from books. And this book of a German photographer, Urformen der Kunst, so basic forms of art, was really published in Berlin in the 20s by this man, Karl Blossfeld. And so he was a very good photographer, and now we rediscover his world, but he was forgotten for many years. And in the Obscure Cities, people were fascinated by these pictures of details of flowers and plants, and some people, some authorities decided to use those photographs as patterns for architecture. Those forms, those archaic forms, simplified forms, are so aesthetic that they decided to recreate the plant. This is the case in the glass city of Calvani. And you can see a giant city which is as a whole glass house with a special climate, and so many people coming to visit this pleasant town, but also with some problems. I cannot describe everything. This is still Calvani, a more recent picture about this town. Françoise Cuyton likes it very much. I'm not sure that I could live there, but certainly I would like to visit it. And in another town in the obscure cities, they had the idea that the whole city will become an homage to uh, Karl Blossfeld. And so the city of Brentano, an old city, took a new name and became Blossfeldstadt. And the elements of certain photographs were taken as a major reference to build a new city. And here we see two poor old people. They were totally forgotten in their old house. And then the authorities want to destroy this house because it's not in the Blossfeldstadt style. So you can see that there is some ironic elements in our stories. It's also a sort of humorous or indirect critique of some ideas of real urban planners or architects. When you think, for example, to the city of Brasilia, which we were lucky enough to visit many years after designing such ideas, you see that there is something so radical and so strange. Then the inhabitants just have to find their place in the town as it is, and the town is more a concept than a reality easy to inhabit. I will not speak about all these stories, of course, because we have created many of them through the years. And in the city of Blossfeldstadt happens this story, The Shadow of a Man, L'ombre d'un homme. And in this story, I was the model at that time for the main character. He has, as you can see, if you look at the picture, some problems with his shadow. Everything is happening as if he is transparent. Other stories in the obscure cities, La Frontière Invisible, or Souvenir de l'Éternel Présent, connected to a movie, Taxandria, by a Belgian director called Raoul Cézé. This story, each story is independent, but some secondary characters or some elements are coming back from one book to another. So you can read each story as a whole thing, but if you read the whole system, the whole structure and all the books, then you will discover new elements. For example, Mary is appearing in another city, in another period of her life. And so Le Guide des Cités has a real travel book, a movie about Brussels, Le Dossier B, the B file, another story about the painter des Ombres, L'Affaire des Ombres, and more recently, we published in French the integral of the obscure cities in 4 very big volumes with a lot of new elements, not only in comics, but also illustrations, texts, theater plays, even a project for an opera, and so on. And we had the great pleasure to be translated in many countries. Now, one of our stories, Urbican, is also translated in Estonian. This is the beautiful Japanese edition. We are also published in China, in Korea, in many European countries. And it's interesting because then we can see that those stories created 30 years ago are still able to interest new readers and even young people, even if the world is so transformed. And probably this is related to the fact that our stories are metaphorical. They are more tales than novels in a way, and you can relate it to the contemporary situation. As for Urbicand and the story of the expansion of this cubic structure, it has some connections, or you can find some connection with the reality that we are supporting, living now. And we created also some objects, some very small, and this specific watch created in Swiss many years ago, but sometimes it is becoming very big in the same spirit. This is in the metro in Paris, La Station Arts et Métiers. These are the first drawings by François Skeuten, the project, and you will be surprised how close it is to what was really built. And if you are visiting Paris, you can discover this metro station, which is with real pieces of metal. It's not an imitation, it's something solid. And of course, most of the people, they don't know that they are traveling in some part, some element of the obscure world. It's very close to a museum of Arts et Métiers with old machines, where we created an exhibition some years ago, Machine à dessiner. You can find on the internet a small movie about this exhibition. So there are some connections between the real world where we live and some imaginary pieces, as in Brussels, where we were deeply implicated in the idea to save a house of Victor Horta. It was in a poor part of the city, and this house called La Maison Autric was in a very bad condition 20 years ago, or little more than 20 years ago. And we persuaded some politicians to buy the house, and then we would help for the transformation of this house, a restoration of all interesting architectural elements, but also to design this house as a small museum, a museum of, let's say, the Belgian houses, so the Belgian Art Nouveau tradition. And so to transform everything, of course, respecting the architectural element when they were there, but sometimes to invent some elements as they could have been created and designed. And this Maison Autric is still possible to visit and discover in Brussels. And one part of one of our last most recent story, La théorie du grain de sable, the theory of the grain of sand, takes place in this house, because Francois designed the house, made so many drawings to persuade people to put some money in it, to help for the restoration, that at a certain moment I said, oh, but we could use the house as part of the story. And he said, oh yes, because I know really this house by heart. And so the story happens in Brussels, but many years after the book Brussels. And you can see this is here 784, but in the obscure calendar, which is very different from our calendar. But fortunately, the months and the days are almost the same. So this is 21 of July. And also strange elements happens again in the city. Here we see Constant Abbes. He was a character of Brussels, but we are now 25 years later. So he's older, he has not his flower shop anymore, and a lot of very strange events will happen in a few days. He finds stones in his apartment, more and more stones, and they all have the same weight. He's fascinated by this phenomenon. He accepts the phenomenon easily in a way. People are accepting a lot of things in the obscure towns. And some other people have different problems, different fantastic problems that, like this man who is losing the contact with the earth, and so he can use the stones. But as you can see, there are two colors in this book: a sort of gray color, or let's say sand color, and a white color for the fantastic elements that we are discovering page after page. This was also a use of the possibilities of the comic art, and of course a special technique to print the book. We printed the gray tone on the paper, and the white parts are just not printed. It would have been impossible to print the white space on the gray color. And there are a lot of very strange things. Mary is part of the story, and we are also traveling to a very different part of the obscure world and discovering other civilizations. So as you can see, each book is an experience, and we have no hero, we have no specific rules. We never decided to have every book in color or every book in black and white. We just want to continue to create with passion and also with talent and patience of the artist, my dear friend Francois Skeuten. We are friends for more than 50 years now, and we still have projects together, even if maybe the obscure cities as a series are now finished. You can continue to dream about it, but we are not sure that we will create a new part of the obscure cities, but we still have projects separately or together. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Benoit. It was truly a nice journey through history, and it was very nice to see the retro futuristic details from the books, and it's really enjoyable lecture.
Thank you.
So now we have a little bit time to have small talk. If audience has any questions, please do so. I have some questions prepared. So at first, I have to say that yes, comics have this nice thing to help really difficult concepts to be more easily to grasp. And I have to say that yes, you have done it very well with Obscure Cities. It has different architectural theories and conflicts in the books. And regarding the 11 albums you've made, do you feel that some of these albums are today really close to your heart more than others, or are they evenly really precious to you?
As you can see, it was created through a very long period, and through our collaboration, which is also friendship, and we imagined this world together, and of course the world changed around us and we changed. And so we try that each book is the right thing to do at a specific moment, because each book represents a lot of work specifically for the artist. 2, 3, maybe sometimes 4 years, because other works are going in parallel. And so we have to be very convinced that this story at this moment is the story that we want to tell. But where does it come from? It's difficult to say. We discuss very often and we dream about a project, and the idea has to convince both of us. And sometimes Francois has an idea, but I don't answer really to this idea, or sometimes I suggest something and he said, oh yes, this would be great maybe for a novel or for a movie, but I don't want to draw it. So each story has to be very specific for the form of comics, and very interesting to draw. This is a secret. After some years, we prefer some stories, but sometimes the reader has other ideas. I would say that the story that I prefer is probably The Leaning Girl, but for the readers, maybe The Tower and Urbicant are their favorite stories. And one thing is also strange is the way that you read it when it's just published. uh, how did people read Urbicant in 1985, and how will they read this story in 2020? We are living in other world. Berlin is not, fortunately, not separated in two towns, but other cities in the world are separated in two towns. And when we think to some fever, we think more to the coronavirus than to any other things. And the reference to the at that time very famous uh, Rubik's Rubik's cube is not as important now. So maybe we have other elements, and um, this specificity is of major importance for fantastic stories, because you can describe a world or a town or a strange adventure, but if it's just a pure fantasy, then maybe you will not care about it. Why does this story concern me? Maybe it's nice, it's funny, it's terrifying, but okay, I read it and I forget it. And our idea is always to give some strong impression and to give you the impression that you will look again at the book, look carefully at some pictures, and then the story is in a way part of you. And some people find, some readers have said that the ending of some of our stories are strange or mysterious, or even they say, I don't like the ending. I like the story, but I don't understand the ending. But for us, this mysterious part, this mysterious ending is really part of our project. It's not a story where you know, oh yes, he was the man who killed the woman at page 4, and now he will put in jail, or now he can marry the girl that he loved, or she can marry the boy or the girl that she loved from the beginning. No, it's a little more mysterious, like in the ending of The Tower. You don't know exactly why the tower was built, why there was the black and white world and the color, but maybe you will continue to dream about this story. And personally, I like this phenomenon. I think Francois likes it also.
Mm.
So at a certain moment, the story belongs to the reader.
Yes, I have to say I really like in Urbicon book. I like how the concept of this mysterious object, artifact, that there's in the end there's an article made by an archivist who says that there is so many different possibilities what this object can be. So the reader can think, and that there's no exact explanation what it is. So I really enjoy it also. Yes, this mystery.
Thank you. In a way, we never know. And I can say we as authors never know why this cubic structure is growing and where it comes from. But this image was appealing to us. And we wanted with this mystery to go as far, to be as logical as possible, to develop a whole story. But the mystery is still there. And it's like the logic of certain dreams. You don't need to have a whole explanation. And sometimes with fantastic story, the explanation can be disappointing. The what is happening is extraordinary, but when you have an explanation, just okay, it's just that. And in our story, we try to avoid this element, and our characters they accept a little more than in our reality to be unable to understand everything. And but if we think to the reality that we are living in, we have exactly the same thing. Why do we like this person and dislike this person? Why do we feel well in this house and not in this one? Why do we want to travel? And it's strange because sometimes people they want to have a more precise explanation in a fiction than their own reality.
Tell us more about your collaboration with Francois when you're starting to make a story. Do you already have an image in your head how this picture should look like, or it's like a cooperation with two together? You reach some kind of understanding quickly.
It's a close collaboration, even if Francois, fortunately, is drawing every image and I'm writing the text. But we discuss a lot of things, the scenery, the layout, the themes, and Francois is really involved in the story, and I'm really involved in the images. You have to remember that we were friends as kids, and at that time there was no separation. When we were painting during the Sunday mornings with his father. We were both creating images. When we were preparing our small newspaper, we were working together even for the printing. And so we had the idea that it's not a strictly professional collaboration. And we of course, we have some, let's say, specific work for each of us, but the most important is to be convinced that we are building the story together and we believe together in the story. We believe also that bande dessinée, in a way, should be done by one person. As for Winsor McCay or Hergé or Hugo Pratt or many others, they were able to create the story and the images, and to think, write, and draw with the same spirit. When you have a collaboration, sometimes you can have narrative and literary qualities inside and graphic qualities in the other side, but sometimes it doesn't fit together. It's still two elements, or sometimes one person is the leading person, let's say the script writer, and he decides everything, and then the artist has just to draw it. But for an artist as François Skeuten, it would be impossible because it would be boring. And so this story is transformed by the art, page after page. I remember when we created the tower, and when I first discovered the effect, the precise effect of the color on a black and white page, I thought, oh, this is much more impressive than what I imagined. And so I know now that this color effect will be the conclusion of the story, because suddenly it was so important. And we can have this also for small details, because sometimes one character, Francois doesn't feel him or her so well, so becomes a small character, and another one we like him, and we want to continue his adventure in another book, or to improve his role in the story. So there are a lot of transformations of the story through the art, and we of course have the general idea of the story before we begin, but a lot of doors and windows are still open, and then we have to solve a lot of difficulties when we are doing the story. So I write the chapters by 6 or 7 pages, and then we see the pages, and then we work together and separately on the new chapter. And we are doing the storyboard together, so the sketches of the pages. Sometimes I arrive with the dialogues, but sometimes we first do the graphic design and then I write the dialogue. Sometimes the dialogue is too short, or sometimes the dialogue is too long, and then we add or suppress certain elements, and when we try to keep the whole things alive during the creative process, because the art of creating comics page is very long, and Francois is alone. He has to create the city, the costumes, the lights, the characters, and so on. And it's a very huge work. Is has a theater play or a movie created by only one person. Let's say two, but specifically one for the materialization of this story, to make it real and not just a sketch or a dream. And we want the reader to believe in it. So the details are very important, and you don't see every detail at the first reading, but you can go back to the book and find new elements.
It's a continuing process. Yeah.
Yes, it's also a pleasure, of course. It's work and pleasure. It's a very long work, but Francois really enjoys the fact to draw for hours or to put colors on the page, and he's also able to hear music or to have a conversation at certain during certain part of the work. So you don't have to imagine it as something terrible. It's long, but it's also a real pleasure.
I have a question about one of the graphic novels. We also have original drawings on the exhibition. It's The Invisible Frontier. And in your books, you always have the architectural scenery that helps to the story to come out. And I was thinking that in The Invisible Frontier, the architecture is made out of it's spherical and domes. It reminds me of the French architect and visionary Etienne Louis Boulle, who imagined, well, who imagined that the perfect house for a person to live in is a sphere. Is this concept related to the story, or would you please describe this story of the invisible frontier and the architectural?
Yes, in the Invisible Frontier, there is the story of a young man working in a geographic institute and preparing a map of the whole country, little more than the country. So there is a close relation between the form of the building and the idea of the world and the map and the representation of a spheric world. But those type of metaphorical elements are also related to the pleasure to invent a building or a town with something very specific. When we see our real towns, they were built through different centuries with a lot of styles and with some elements of planification and order, but also a lot of chaotic elements. Sometimes you have a street which is very harmonious, and then a skyscraper in the middle of the street, or a destroyed house, or so on. And in the graphic form of the obscure city, the ideas are very radical. So when there is a form, when there is a structure, we go to the ending. If we have the city of Calvani with all the glass houses, then the whole city has this form. We don't want that real cities are as radical. It would be very difficult to live in such town. But we think that this type of, let's say, caricature, even if it's not a funny caricature, but a serious caricature, or this type of metaphor gives to the story a direct form. Things are happening more clearly. In a way, our cities are concept. We add some details, but we want to tell a drama and to give a clear form. Maybe in a way it's closer to opera or theater than to movies. We don't use reality as it is with the normal cars and bicycles and all the normal ordinary life. We choose only certain elements because every element has to be drawn and created, and to give in 80 pages or 100 pages a strong impression to the reader. So the architecture, the town, the nature are intended to be narratively interesting for us, and to give something to think about or to dream about. But we don't have the idea that ideal cities should be as radical. And if somebody would like to build Urbicand or to build Samaris, we would be totally scared and find it crazy. When it's a metro station or a museum, you can create something really strong with a very specific form because you don't have to live in it. If you work in the museum, you live part of your life. But if you are in a metro station, for example, it's like a monument. You are just there for a few minutes, so you can have a strong impression. But in a normal city, I prefer the addition of contradictions and different styles.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of the story of Urbicand also. How you can go from order to chaos, but to find life. And what is strange in Urbicand is that we created chaos with a structure fighting another structure, and something happens. But you have to remember also that in Urbicon, we have a fixed structure, which is a town, and a moving structure, which is the cubic structure, which is like a giant plant or tree. So life.
Mhm. Does audience have some questions? Aha, I see. I will bring the microphone.
Thank you. And thank you for the lecture. It was enjoyable. I don't have a question, maybe rather a comment. When we live in some way, we don't often reflect it, or sometimes, and we need art for that. And this reason, I think this was a great book and great exhibition, because it reflects the different ways of thinking about the city. And often as architecture, I find myself in a quite tricky situation to explain people how the way of thinking reflects in a building environment. And now I have a great book to show them that there might be different ways of thinking in one time, in one place, and don't have to fight for one and the right one, but maybe try to find out the best of the coexistence of them. So that was the benefit, and thank you for that.
Thank you very much. We think that comics and graphic novel have a lot of possibility to show a space. It can be a large space or small space. It can be urban space or more natural space. But we have a question of scale. It's not just like a map, or not just like a model, or not just like a plane, seeing the structure, discovering the structure of a whole town. With comics, we have to represent things from a human point of view. And if we have now a digital simulation of a town, we can have every point of view, but sometimes some of those points of view are totally abstract. But when you are describing a story following the characters, they interact with their environment. And I think this could be interesting in realistic architecture, to use this type of representation, not just have, as in some old town planning and design, you have very small characters and cars and so on, but they are totally abstract. The mother with the two children, but they are totally stereotypes. They have no real life. And if you imagine a story in a house or in an apartment, and so you will see the specific needs of every person and how they will use the space. Like sometimes in some modern or large buildings or new parts of town, the town planners have decided that people will go through this way, this road. But then you put the children and they find their own way, and they trace a new road. And I think this is the real specificity of human architecture and town planning, not just considering the general design or the great perspective or the power effect, political power effect, but as in East Berlin, where the city was too big and too empty. But when we use this representation of one or two or three characters interacting with their apartment, is exactly like when we are living in a place for some years and we see, oh, here I feel well, and this part of the apartment I cannot use, or I cannot put my bed here, but I prefer to put it here. And when we are creating a story, those questions are very, very important, even if the world is strange or fantastic.
There is one question in the audience.
Hello, Mr. Peters. Thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting to hear from your own mouth about all these things that I've read up on the internet. So thank you. I would love to hear you speculate on something. It seems to me that in your graphic novels, retrofuturism is very important. Like, for example, how the people in 1900s saw the future, or like I've seen some documentaries about the Paris World Exhibition, and there were all kinds of strange ideas that the streets would move and people would just step on the street and the street would move them to a place. And of course, it didn't happen. Well, it happened in airports, I guess, but not the way they envisioned. So my question is, it may be strange to speculate on it, but are you familiar right now with some futuristic ideas that probably will not happen like they are envisioned right now? But let's just say that people now in 2000s think about the future, they are wrong. But let's say that in many, many decades, new Scotin and Peters will come and make obscure cities for the new century. What kind of futuristic ideas do you think would interest you then? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and difficult question. What I can say is that at the beginning, we both felt that we were not so interested by a realistic representation of the town and the life and the cars and so. And we were not really interested by pure science fiction. So we were really inspired by the turn of 1900 and 20th century, by the novels of Jules Verne, the drawings of Robida and some others, by those dreams or nightmares of architecture by the futurists or by Le Corbusier or so on. And we mixed all those elements and we felt very comfortable with this idea that was called by certain journalists the future of the past, or we can also say the past of the future. There was a moment, let's say the Jules Verne moment, where many discoveries were made and people were dreaming to a better future. And so they thought that technology and invention would continue and we would go faster and faster, and the cities would be bigger and bigger. And so, and when we began in the 80s, this modernist utopia was not totally at the end. This dream was still there, but the critic of this modernist vision of continuous progress, the critics were already there, but then, of course, the political situation between Eastern countries and Western countries, it changed in the end of the 80s. The representation of the world and international order changed, and probably this element of critique of the old utopia was not as important. So our stories change a lot. And now we feel that it's very difficult to project ourselves in the future. Science fiction is really like a Black Mirror, or many other series with very sad representation. We feel the disaster day after day, the disaster of the idea of progress. We have all in different ways, let's say the Greta Thunberg syndrome, the idea that the world of tomorrow will be worse than the world of today, which is not very good already. And it's in a way difficult to dream a new future. We don't want to add some nightmares to the actual difficulties. And as you say, maybe artists of a new generation with other references will try to imagine something. There was the steampunk wave using some images of the industrial age, which was not so pleasant, as we know. But now we need some new representation, and maybe we are not just now the best person to do it. But one of our books is called Les Portes du Possible. It doesn't belong to the obscure cities. It happens in our world, but in the near future. And we try to show some sometimes funny, pleasant, or strange images and some anecdotes of a possible future, which is not totally dark. And we tried also in the story Revoir Paris, which is mixing elements of the past, dreams of the past and dreams of the future. But probably this will be a major option for artists of the new generation, for comics, movies, novels, and so to try to avoid some stereotypes and to invent new visions, because we cannot just be working with the dark images. I think fiction and art has to invent new images, even if they are pure imagination. We need them, and we need, in a way, to believe in a sort of future. But I'm not sure that Francois and me are now the best person to make this existing in an interesting form.
Mm-hmm. There's in the chat some of the questions. I'll pick maybe 2 questions. I think we don't have much time, sadly, but I'll start with Elko Bronsema question about a novel. He asks if could you imagine to write a novel in the La Cité, something like Skeuten did with Robert Adams with The Compelled?
I think it's a very interesting form. I just had a look on this project, which is still developing. In some of our books, we are close to novels or novellas, like in The Archivist or in L'Écho des Cités. The form is not strictly the form of comics, and if you have a look to the 4-volume of the integral of the Obscure Cities, you will see a lot of narrative text and description about characters and so. But in fact, we were interested for years by this strict and difficult discipline of comic strip. Small images with text telling every element of a story. And now maybe Francois Skeuten got a little bored by this strict discipline, and he has more pleasure to create larger pieces with a narrative aspect and to find new interactions between text and images. And I try also in my own work to develop other forms. some people don't consider a lot the form of a comic book, and they think that it's childish. But when you are working on it, you see how difficult it is, and uh, uh, how much energy and patience you need to create such a book as Brussels or The Leaning Girl or The Tower. It's a real huge work, and sometimes the people are more impressed by just one large picture. But when you work for comics, you see how difficult it is, and maybe we have done it for almost 40 years, and we will try now new forms, new ways to tell stories and develop our imagination or our concepts.
So there's a question from Arunava Banerjee, who asks this question. Psychoanalysis is another field that Peters has worked extensively on. Does it have any bearing on his work in La Cité Obscure?
Every experience that we have can be part of a story. Working for a biography, working for architecture of Françoise Keuten, being interested by a photographer, discovering a new country, everything can, in a way, give new possibilities to next stories. But it's very, let's say, it doesn't work directly. Sometimes it's years after a certain event or a certain travel that we discuss together and say, oh, we could use this character, you remember this person and so on, or you remember that place. Or maybe sometimes the process is totally unconscious, but just we were transformed by another work that we do. And I must say that in the obscure cities, we had a total freedom. We still have a total freedom. We can add a volume if we want. And our publisher, Casterman, accepts our ideas, and some books are selling really well and some books are not selling so well, but it's not a major problem. We never had a huge pressure about this type of results. So we have chosen this type of freedom, and when we feel that a story needs to be told, we enter in it, but we don't want to add books after books and year after year. We have to feel a necessity. And for the moment, we prefer to explore different ways. And I like to go from fiction to reflection. And Francois likes to go from his drawings to this 3D reality and the possibility to build something or to have his imagination becoming concrete.
Mm-hmm. And also there's question about works on Tintin. Is there a plan to translate your work on this theme?
Oh, my books were translated in different languages, but it depends of the celebrity of the subject. So in certain countries, Tintin is very famous. So for example, a biography of Hergé can interest a lot of people. In some countries, it wouldn't make sense because the Tintin books are not as famous. I had the same experience with Jacques Derrida, who was a difficult philosopher, but my biography was translated in 11 countries. And I hope that the book about Ferenczi, who is not as famous, will be also translated, but I have no influence on this process. Is exactly like the success of a book. We will have now the new Urbicand in color. Will it be successful? Will people like the story 35 years after the first publication? We don't know. We just hope, and we try to do our best when we are working on a book. But the rest belongs to the audience, which can be very difficult from one country to another. For example, in Japan, they have a strong tradition for comics with mangas. In China, they don't have such a tradition. The Obscure Cities arrived there many years after the first publications, and we were anxious. Would people be interested? And it happened, but it was never a mass success. It was maybe more for the artist or for literary readers. I don't know, because, for example, China, Tintin arrived very recently, so there was no transmission from generation to generation. But in Belgium and in France, we had a very long tradition of comics. So the families had comics, and the parents read them to the children. And then the children, as adults, continue this tradition with their own children. It's different from one country to another, this type of perception. And also the subject of a story can be, at a certain moment, can seem very interesting for the people, and at a certain moment we don't care about it. We don't see the point. And we don't know how people will read our stories in 10 or 20 years. Maybe nobody would be interested. Maybe they will read it in a very different way. Maybe as a memory of a disappeared world or disappeared illusions.
Well, I think that these graphic novels, they are really actual and fresh even today. So I truly see that it's you will have many readers in the future as well.
Thank you.
So the time is against us. So I really like to thank you for this lovely chat and this great lecture. And
thank you, everybody. It would have been a pleasure to be together and to discuss more freely, but I think we have, with the help of Zoom and of the technology, found a way to share something.
yeah, sometimes technology can be good.
Yes.
So, yeah. So thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much, and goodbye. Au revoir. Bonne soirée. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.